Let's talk about rapiers and side swords and look at an amazing early rapier. Or is it a side sword? Hi folks, Matt Easton here at Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm at the moment at Olympia Auctions looking at some of the amazing things that are in the upcoming sale on the 26th of June, linked down below. And this is one of the things that immediately caught my eye because I absolutely love the relatively simple design of the hilt, the fact that it's quite early. It's been dated to around 1540, I'd say, yeah, maybe a shade later than that, maybe 1550, maybe 1560, but yes, it's a fairly early rapier. Or is it a side sword? Well, here's the problem, okay? So the rapier, the term rapier, as I've spoken about in many, many videos over the years, is incredibly problematic because what's a rapier to one person is a long sword to Joseph Swetnam, for example. So there is no one definition of what a rapier is. It's not a dress sword, it's not only a civilian sword, it's not only a thrust-centric sword. It's a combination of factors that come together into something where we say, yeah, everybody would agree that's a rapier. And there are some things behind me that I think we'd all agree are rapiers. But this isn't one of those. This is something where I think that me or certain other people out there, maybe you, might say this is a bit more of a side sword. And what adds to that is the dating of this. Now, the dating is based on a number of features, not so much the blade, more to do with the hilt design in this case. And you'll notice that this is a very asymmetrical hilt where we have two rings on one side and we have thumb protection on the other side. Now, the reason for asymmetrical hilts I've spoken about many times in the past is they are more comfortable to wear depending on how you wear the sword. But generally speaking, if it comes in to encounter your body or a horse's body at all, then having a hilt which is more minimal on one side is better because it sits against your body more comfortably. Now obviously if you're wearing the sword hung in such a way that the hilt's out in front of you, then that doesn't really matter so much, but anyway. So this is a relatively asymmetrical hilt, and the form of the hilt, the exact design of it, gives the approximate dating, I would say, of 1540 to 1560. Now, the complicated thing with 16th century swords is we do sometimes find, and you can find this in paintings, for example, and portraits of people, sometimes they're wearing a sword in the year 1590, which looks like it's from 1550. Sometimes even later, and we do in fact find swept hilts still being used at the time of the English Civil War in the 1640s, which if we didn't see them in a portrait, we would probably date to the 1590s. Now, we've got a question there. Does that mean that the sword is of an old design and someone wanted the more old-fashioned design still in 1640? Or does it mean that it's literally an older sword? And this is always possible, of course. Some people might have liked to wear their father or grandfather's sword for sentimental reasons, or because they carried it in some famous battle or something. We don't know. Anyway, to approximately date this is from around the middle of the 1500s. That means it's really at the very beginning, the earliest part of what we'd classically call the rapier era. People like Agrippa's treatise, where he's starting to show recognizable rapierish form, okay? If we go earlier than that, if we go to Marozzo, for example, in 1536, then the way he's using the sword is really very different, and we commonly call this side sword. Now, the problematic thing about the term side sword is it's not historical at all, but people in period just called it spada, or sword. They didn't call it a rapier, so we only make this differentiation based a little bit on the design and a little bit on the way that it was used. And in a nutshell, rapier method is more thrust-centric and side sword method is more cut and thrust equally. And this is a sword which both in time period is more into the side sword period, although side swords continued into a much later period as well. But in addition to that, it has good cutting capacity. It's not the broadest blade in the world, but it has some breadth to it, but more importantly perhaps, the edge geometry and the thickness of the blade, in other words the distal taper, mean that the blade is fairly flexible and fairly thin here. That means that if you cut with this sword at speed, it is going to cut fairly well. It's not going to cut as well as a Messer or as a Schiavona or a sabre, but it is nevertheless going to cut with a, shall we say, spadroon-like effectiveness. So it is a cut and thrust blade. It's not an utterly specialised thrusting blade. That being said, it is 40 inches long, so it isn't short by any means. It's a fairly long blade and it's a fairly narrow blade. So I would regard this, if we said that rapier is a fixed thing and sidesword is a fixed thing, this is almost the junction between the two. This is almost the crossing line between what I would call a sidesword and what I would call a rapier. It's halfway between the two. In other words, it's a cut and thrust rapier. It's a fairly middle ground rapier that's extremely effective and beautiful, beautiful in the hand. The blade, as I say, is I think it's just over 40 inches long. It's about 102 centimeters, and it feels like an absolute dream in the hand. It's got a beautifully proportioned hilt. The finger goes over there onto the ricasso really beautifully. You have a thickened ricasso with a blunt edge on here, so it's utterly suited to having a finger over. I can just about fit 2 fingers over, which is a later Spanish way of holding it, but I could hold it like that. With this particular sword, 1 finger over feels more correct, feels nicer. The bars don't interfere with my knuckle, so sometimes you find with swords of this period the hilts are quite confined and interfere with the knuckles. This doesn't. It doesn't touch my hand at all. And the pommel, I absolutely love this pommel. It looks like an unknown alien fruit, but the way that you've got these incised lines here going up and then cross-hatching on each line, it's just absolutely gorgeous. And you've even got that echoed on the wire-wrapped grip, which itself has checkers on it and then has the Turk's heads top and bottom. I don't know whether the grip is original. If it's been redone in a later period, it's been done extremely well in the period style and it looks great. Everything is solid and firm and tight on this sword. There's maybe a tiniest bit of movement in the guard, but it's just an absolutely gorgeous sword, and the type of sword that could have been worn in civilian life, could have been carried in war, on horseback, on foot, and it's just a lovely, lovely piece, and I'm very happy to have been able to get my hands on it. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you've enjoyed seeing this gorgeous sword as much as I've enjoyed holding it, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.